Dr. Shabir, let's talk about Joseph, the beautiful story of Joseph. I know that within the Quran, this is the most complete story of a prophet.
Yes.
That we see, and it's pretty, it's one surah, one chapter, and the story is told, verse by verse in chronological order. Within the Bible as well, is that the case?
Yes. In fact, generally in the Bible, the stories of the prophets are told sequentially, especially when we deal with the book of Genesis, in which Joseph's story is found.
So it seems to me when I read the story that both in the Bible and the Quran, the narrative is very similar, or the story is very similar. There are just some very minor differences.
Yes, and some of the minor differences have to do with the way in which the Bible was put together according to historians. Nowadays, historians generally accept an idea that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, referred to otherwise as the Torah, were put together from various strands of narrative. One strand is referred to as J because it uses the name Jehovah for God. Another strand is referred to as the E strand because it uses the word Elo for God, or Elohim. And a third strand is called P, and that is called the priestly strand. The idea is that when the Jewish leaders returned from Jerusalem after their exile, they had the 2 strands, the J and E, to work with, and then the priests spliced them together, adding their own narrative in between as a kind of a cement to give a flow to the whole sequence, and to add their own interpretation and viewpoint as well. So then we have flowing within the book of Genesis these 3 strands, the J, E, and P. The D is Deuteronomy, which is reserved for the Deuteronomic narrative, starting with the book of Deuteronomy, one of these 5 books. So the story of Joseph then is pieced together from various narratives, and that gives rise to a certain degree of discrepancy between the narratives, which were preserved as they are. So then we have the strangeness that when Joseph was placed in the well, an Ishmaelite caravan came and they picked him up and they went and sold him into Egypt. But then soon after that we learned that the Midianites came and picked him up and sold him to the Ishmaelites, and they took him to Egypt. And then yet we learned that the Midianites picked him up and sold him into Egypt. So these different narratives were kept to a certain extent as they were, and this gives rise to the difference in the narratives like this. But otherwise, we see a story flowing, showing Joseph as a young boy, and then developing into manhood and becoming the virtual ruler in Egypt, where he eventually welcomes his family, and they pay obeisance to him, fulfilling the dream that he had seen previously.
Tell me about this, because it seems like Joseph had this special power or special knowledge from God to be able to interpret dreams.
Yes, in the Quranic narrative, Joseph is shown to be one of the prophets, and he is blessed by God with this interpretation of dreams. Adding to this, we can say that in the Islamic tradition, it is thought that dreams constitute one portion of prophethood. So prophets see things through dreams, and that is God's way of guiding them so that they could guide other human beings. So Joseph sees in a dream that the sun and the moon and the 11 planets are prostrating to him. And when he mentions this to his father, the father says, do not relate this to your brothers, otherwise they may seek to harm you. So he keeps this to himself, and eventually he will see this fulfilled as his father and mother. This represents the sun and the moon, and then the 11 planets representing his brothers would all show obeisance to him, as people did to their kings and rulers in those times.
He also interpreted the dreams of some other fellow prisoners, we know, while he was in prison, and he interpreted the dream of the ruler, or in the Bible, this ruler is referred to as the Pharaoh, but not in the Quran, right?
Yeah, so in the Quranic narrative, it is said that when he was in prison, he interpreted the dreams of some of his prison mates, and the Quran shows him to be a preacher of monotheism. So before he even interpreted the dreams of these people, he asked them, what is better, the one God, overwhelming, or the multiple gods that people are worshiping? And he says that these are not true gods, but only names people have invented. Then he told them the interpretations of their dreams, and he asked the one who was going to remain alive, please mention me to the king or to the ruler. And eventually, when the king himself has a dream and wants to know the interpretation of this dream, this former prison mate of Joseph recalls that Joseph can interpret dreams, and then he interprets the dream to say that it means that Egypt will suffer from famine. And the best way to prepare for that is to reserve the grains that are available in the time of plenty to suffice for the time of famine. And that was a successful plan. Mm-hmm. So with this, Joseph was able to rise to prominence as not only a good interpreter of dreams, but also a man who could be trusted to be in a position of authority and to govern such things as the storage and redistribution of grains.
Mm-hmm. How is God depicted in this story of Joseph?
God is depicted as being in control of all human affairs, so that even though people may be up to their own devices, despite their machinations, God is bringing about his own purposes in the end. So Joseph was taken by his brothers, thrown into a well, and God lifted him up to a position of prominence and rulership in Egypt. This could not have been foreseen by his brothers or even by he himself. Mm-hmm.
To the point that he fulfilled the dream that God had given him.
Exactly,
at the end,
exactly. Yeah. There must have been a time in his life when, from a human point of view, it would have seemed that it's not going to happen. Like, how is this going to happen? But then God brings it to pass. So God may be bringing things to pass in our own lives that we cannot foresee, and we just have to retain our faith in God and look to stories like that of Joseph for our moment of inspiration to keep us going.
So is God depicted in the same way within the biblical narrative of Joseph?
In the biblical narrative, God is not that much prominent like in a blow-by-blow basis as he is in the Quranic narrative, though obviously the same end result is achieved in that God is in control of all things, and God brings about the best for Joseph and his family. Mm-hmm.
Do you want to mention anything about Jacob in this story?
Yes, Jacob is depicted as a prophet of God who is given knowledge, and so he has a sense that his son is not dead, but will eventually be found, and so he sends his other sons, go, inquire about Joseph. He has the sense that Joseph is still alive, even when the sons thought that he might have been dead. Then he exercises great patience, according to the Quran. And that patience is what becomes now the subject matter for much Muslim preaching in the Friday sermons in Muslim mosques. We will find often a reference to the patience of Job, but also, which is proverbial, but also the patience of the father of Yusuf.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your time, Dr. Shabir Ali.
You're welcome.